Reaganomics, a popular term used to refer to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, the 40th U.S. president, which called for widespread tax cuts, decreased social spending, increased military spending, and the deregulation of domestic markets. In the 1980s, his policies worked very well for the struggling U.S. economy. The stock market was booming, it seemed like everyone was employed, and Americans had never been more hopeful. Do we still feel that way today? Do his policies still work? How did they, and do they, affect the American people? So how has Reaganomics affected you personally?
Well, when I was starting out as a musician back in the 80s, actually it was 1983, I noticed that my Social Security tax all suddenly doubled. And this was part of the Reaganomics, where they cut the tax at the top so they could get more money to trickle down money to other people. And the one way he made up for some of that was to double the Social Security tax and then use Social Security as a budget resource, which is another story. But that meant that my Social Security tax went from 7.5% to 15%. See, what happened was that when you worked on 1099 as contract labor, that you have to pay all the Social Security, which is roughly 15, with different tax items. It can go down to 13.9 or 14 or stuff like that. But what he did was that, or what they did was, they made all the self-employed people pay all the tax. What used to happen was that, or what happens now is when you're employed, you pay 7.5%, your employer pays 7.5%. And what used to happen before that was we, self-employed, would pay 7.5%, and the government, I guess, would get the break or something. They pay 7.5%, I don't know what happened, but they cut that out. So all suddenly, if you were, say, some dude making $10,000 a year, which is nothing, you'd have to pay like $1,500 in tax, which is an incredible amount of money if you, and there was no break. No break. It didn't matter how poor you were. There's no break there because it comes right off of Schedule C, and there's no tax break no matter how poor you are. So it's not cool.
As my father just said, Reaganomics did a lot to how taxes work. The rich had their tax rates lowered from 70% to 28%. Because of this, Social Security had to be increased, and many government programs had to have decreased funding or be completely cut off. But not everyone had such a negative experience with it. My mother said she had a very positive experience. She was in college at the time and said President Reagan had given her hope and that she personally agreed with his policies. Under Reagan's presidency, the national debt tripled, military spending was drastically increased. Even though we were in a peacetime, many government programs experienced massive budget cuts, and the rich received a huge decrease in their tax rates. So what does that mean for us today?
System. The Fed has always had dual responsibilities: monetary policy and regulatory and supervisory policy. But in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, Congress gave the Fed even more regulatory and supervisory authority than it had before. The new chair of the Fed, Janet Yellen, recently acknowledged the board's supervisory responsibilities are just as important as its better-known obligation to set interest rates and conduct monetary policy. I think the lapses that led to the 2008 crisis drove that point home with searing intensity. The Fed is now our first line of defense against another crisis, and we've made progress through the Dodd-Frank Act. Even so, the risk of another crisis remains unacceptably high.
Remember the stock market crash in 2008? Something similar happened in 1987. Due to the government having less regulatory power, banks gave out risky loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. The Dow Jones lost 22% of its value. Sound familiar? The problem is, we're using a theory that only worked for a little while back then and completely failed today. We keep repeating our mistakes. In the 80s, it was an age of prosperity and optimism. In the 90s, doom and gloom. In the 2000s, back again to prosperity. in the 2010s, we were in yet another horrific economic recession. You're probably asking, what can be done to fix this? Well, for starters, we could decrease our tax breaks for the rich. Since the 80s, it seemed to be that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Plus, this could help fund said struggling government programs. We could also decrease spending on the military. There's absolutely no need for us to spend the amount we do. By putting more money aside, we could focus on at least attempting to decrease our staggering national debt and possibly put more money into further developing a very strong middle class. But who knows? We'll just have to see what this election holds for us.
Keep on